Okay, I'll go ahead and start so we can keep to the time and people will be joining us through this brief introduction. So welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Martin. I'm the moderator of the GBV AOR Community of Practice. I think a lot of you are familiar with my name in your mailbox. We are proud to welcome you today to this webinar where we're going to be highlighting this really fascinating paper looking at the potential patriarchal pitfalls of an inclusive approach to gender-based violence. Before we start and get into the meat of the discussion, I just want to give you a little bit of information about the community of practice for those of you who are not a member. So the GBV AOR Community of Practice is part of the global gender-based violence area of responsibility through the Global Protection Cluster. So we're a virtual community of about 1,000 gender-based violence and emergency specialists all over the world. The Community of Practice offers an online platform to provide support to build your capacity on responding and preventing to gender-based violence through peer-to-peer support, webinars like this, some training courses, and other products. So if you're interested, you can go to the website, and I'll put it in the chat to find out more information. And if you're interested in joining, we welcome you. The membership is for individuals. You don't join for your organization. You join as an individual. And it's for anyone who's working in GBV and emergencies. If you want some more information, again, I'll put this in the chat so that you can write to us with any questions you might have. So one of our sister projects is the Gender-Based Violence at GBV AOR Help Desk. So the Help Desk provides rapid technical advice and support and can do a lot of evidence digest, provide some peer-to-peer support with you, and it's all for free. So if you have a question that you can't find the answer to on GBV and emergencies, we recommend that you write to the GBV AOR Help Desk, and you can email them at the information on the screen there. And again, I'll put that in the chat so that you also have that information for yourself. So some of the questions everyone always has that I would like to answer at the beginning. We will record this webinar, and everyone who is registered for it will get a link to it probably tomorrow or maybe the day after so that you can watch it. All of the Community of Practice webinars are recorded, and we put them on the GBV AOR YouTube channel. So you can go back and look at other webinars we've had on things like GBV and climate change, supporting male survivors, looking at disability inclusive work, survivor-centered approach to PSEA, a lot of different topics. We've been doing this for about 5 years, so there's a number of webinars there. I'll put the link to the YouTube channel in the chat as well. We'd like to ask you to stay to the end if you can, because we do have a small evaluation poll that we will launch about 5 minutes before the end. And we're always looking for information from you just to make sure that we're meeting the needs that you have. I'm also going to share with you the article that we're discussing today in the chat, but also again in an email afterwards. And it's open source, so you'll be able to download it and read it yourself. And then, of course, if you have any thoughts or comments or questions or anything you want to share with us, you can write to us at gbvcop@gmail.com. Okay, so that's the business of the webinar. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, What About the Men? Potential Patriarchal Pitfalls of Inclusive Approaches to Gender-Based Violence. I'd like to introduce the chair, Ilaria Michaelis. So Ilaria is an independent consultant who's focused on GBV, sexual exploitation and abuse, sexual harassment, and LGBTQI+ inclusion in humanitarian response. She's been working in the humanitarian sector for over 15 years across East and Central Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. We met with her work in IRC when she worked with them, and I know many of you probably know her from her time there as well. But also I had the pleasure of working with her on looking at LGBTQI+ inclusive response to SEA. She is currently writing her PhD at Cambridge University on intersectionality and GBV response services. So she's going to introduce everyone else to you. So I'll shut up now, and it is my pleasure to turn it over to you, Ilaria.
Hi, sorry about that. Slight malfunction there, but hopefully you can all hear me now. Thank you very much for the introduction and for having us and putting together this fantastic panel, Sarah. Um, so I will just not take up too much time, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how this webinar will be structured and then introduce our wonderful speaker. So first and foremost, we will start with a brief 10-minute chat by Philip and Henry, who will present the key points of their article titled Broadening the Scope but Reasserting Male Privilege, Potential Patriarchal Pitfalls of Inclusive Approaches to Gender-Based Violence. So for all of us who haven't maybe had the time to read the article before coming in, no panic, because they will give a quick introduction to the article and the key arguments within the article first. Following that, Onen and Pinar will also take about 5 minutes each to respond to the article based on their own work and experience as practitioners in these fields and researchers. So we'll hear from them about what they have found valuable and interesting within the article and how that relates to their work. Following these two introductory conversations, we will have a panel discussion that will last about 30 minutes, where all panelists will answer a set of questions. And finally, for the last 25 minutes of today's session, we will have questions. We will answer questions from the audience. So let me encourage you, please, to send your questions in via the chat, not the Q&A function, the chat function, and feel free to send questions as we all go along throughout the seminar, the webinar, sorry. So that once we come to the Q&A, we already have a set of questions ready to ask. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists. Henry Mertinen is a visiting research fellow at the University of Bremen, as well as a freelance consultant, and he has approximately 20 years of experience working on issues of gender and violence, including on gender-based violence against men and boys and gender-diverse person, and working with men to prevent GBV. Zeynep Pinar Erdem is a doctoral researcher at the University of Bremen. Pinar is focusing on the experiences of lesbian, bisexual, and trans forced migrant women in Turkey and Lebanon, in particular focusing on their vulnerabilities, invisibility, and agency. She has worked as a researcher and a consultant for Mosaic MENA, UNFPA Turkey, and Human Rights Watch on projects related to refugees of diverse SOGIESC, sexual orientation, gender identities, expression, and sexual characteristic, as well as project related to refugee men and boys in conflict and displacement, including conflict-related sexual violence, and their experiences in accessing services in Turkey and Lebanon. Our third panelist is Onen David Onwech, who is also pursuing a PhD at the University of Bremen, where he works on political agency of forced migrants with diverse SOGIESC. Onen has a decade-long experience in direct service provision to forced migrants in Uganda with the Refugee Law Project at the School of Law, Makerere University. So he has been working directly with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, including men and boys, as well as households raising children born out of experiences of sexual violence. And finally, last but very not least, Philip Schulz is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Intercultural International Studies at the University of Bremen. For his previous research, Philip worked closely with male survivors of wartime sexual violence in Uganda to explore their experiences of gendered harms, but also their perspectives on justice and agency. His current research focuses on practices of love and care in the wake of violence and loss. So without further ado, I'd love to invite Philip and Henry to take the floor and talk to us about their fantastic article.
Great, thank you so much for having me, and great to see so many participants. Both Philip and I are also extremely happy to have Onen and Pinar joining us. So a lot of the work that we draw on in the article has been conducted together with the organizations in which Onen and Pinar have been working. Onen with the Refugee Law Project in North Uganda, and with Pinar, I've been working very closely on projects with Mosaic MENA, especially in Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey, and looking at sort of the impacts of conflict and displacement and gendered harms on persons of SOGIESC. What I will do is give you a bit of a short overview of the article, and sorry that I'm a bit backlit, it's a bit dark here in my room here in Thailand. But yeah, so I'll be giving you a bit of an overview of the article, some of the key arguments that we make, and I'll talk a bit more about the third part of the article around diverse SOGIESC, and then I will hand over to Philip Schultz, who will talk more about the kind of the central part of the argument around the gendered harms against men through sexual violence, especially in conflict, but also the risks and pitfalls of remasculinization and recentering of men's experiences in the patriarchy in this work. So as the title already kind of says, what we want to look at is the challenges and the potential pitfalls, the risks of taking a much broader approach to GBV than what is often done in the humanitarian sector. So looking at the gendered harms and gender-based violence, sexual violence against men and boys, but also against persons of diverse SOGIESC, and taking those harms, gendered harms, seriously, and listening to the ways in which men and persons of diverse SOGIESC have been affected by these forms of violence. But then also thinking through what this then responding to these gendered harms and also expectations of some of the survivors, what kind of risks does that bring with it, both for a sector more broadly, but also in terms of interpersonal relations, and Philip will talk more about that once I finish with my overview section. So one of the central issues that we're looking at in the first part of the argument of the article is then how do we work with sexual violence against men and boys, but also against gender diverse persons within frameworks of gender-based violence that often tend to focus on violence against women and girls, and do so for very good reason, because women and girls are the main survivors of gender-based violence. But how do we, within that framework, then still make the space or open the spaces to talk about men's experiences, boys' experiences, diverse gender persons' experiences? And a lot of the controversy there has been on the one hand, on a conceptual level. Should we keep the focus on violence against women and girls, which has been and continues to be underfunded and under-resourced and under-addressed in peacetime as in and conflict times and crisis times? Or is there a possibility of broadening it? What would a broadening mean in terms of potentially diluting the focus of this work and having sort of meaningful questioning of patriarchal norms and values and how they lead to gender-based violence? And importantly, unfortunately, also what would it mean for funding, because there is incredible underfunding of the whole sector. And if we do broaden the space to also look at men and boys, gender diverse persons, what does that mean for the already underfunded work with women and girls? What we don't have that much in the article, but what is also a real concern is also the use of the topic of sexual violence against men and boys and of gender-based violence against men and boys in a way to undermine discussions, debates, and work on violence against women and girls. So there's oftentimes in debates a certain degree of whataboutism. So when issues of gender-based violence against women are raised, there is this, well, what about the men? What about the boys? Which is not often, unfortunately, coming out of a place of genuine concern for the lives of male survivors, but more as a way of stopping the discussion on gender-based violence against women. And these are also issues that and controversies and debates that we see not only in the space of working on gender-based violence and how to define it, or working on sexual violence against men and boys, but we also see them echoed, which we don't cover in the article, in discussions about working with perpetrators of gender-based violence and how much that should be also a focus as compared to working with the survivors and their needs. So that's the first part of the article, looks at these different debates. Then the second part, where Philip will talk a bit more about in a moment, is around how sexual violence against men and boys really attacks men's sense of self on multiple levels, on the ideological sense of self, gender sense of self, but also material ways of being a man, and sexuality and virility and so on, and their social status, and how oftentimes there is a wish for a certain degree of undoing what is seen as an emasculating experience of sexual violence against men and boys, and some of the difficulties, conceptual but also practical and political consequences that this kind of a remasculinization might bring with it. In the third section, then, we then also look at what a broadening of the scope to also integrate gender diverse persons and sexual violence and gender-based violence against persons of diverse SOGIESC would mean for the sector. And Pinar will be talking about this more in a moment as well. And one of the issues we saw there is that there has been an unfortunate trend of sort of collapsing violence against LGBTQI persons with sexual violence against men and boys, and thereby then often invisibilizing violence against lesbian and bisexual women, but also not looking at the very different ways in which this violence is used against cisgender, cisgender heterosexual men and boys compared to homophobic, transphobic, biphobic violence against persons of diverse SOGIESC. So what we argue for in the paper there is for a need to take this much, much more nuanced approach and intersectional approach to understanding the gender-based violence against persons of diverse SOGIESC, not conflating it with sexual violence against boys more broadly, and taking the needs of lesbian, bisexual, and trans women more seriously. But that was a quick overview of the article, and over to Philip for a discussion of the central argument there.
Great, thank you so much for that, Henry. And just echoing you, it's great to see so many of you interested in this topic, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions and to be in conversation with you. Ilaria told me I have about 2 minutes by now, I guess, so I'll try to keep this very short. But just to pick up on a point that Henry made, one of the sort of central aspects in the paper that we seek to tackle is the fact that in some of this now more sort of newly emerging, yet arguably still quite limited work with and on male survivors, there often are these implicit and sometimes also very explicit what we call re-masculinizing messages, by which we mean that there often is a notion that survivors are or want to be put back into these positions of masculine and patriarchal privilege. So oftentimes there's a very real and prevalent notion of no longer being a real man or considered to be a man as a result of sexual violence as experienced by survivors, and the existing programming often sort of addresses that and seeks to undo some of that, which on the one hand makes a lot of sense because these are survivors' very real concerns and experiences, and we need to take them seriously. But we also have some more, I think, ambivalent feelings about that, because there are some, as we say in the article, potential pitfalls of these approaches in terms of re-establishing these patriarchal and heteronormative status quos, whereby these men are or want to be put back into these positions of male privileges. And so, again, that makes sense from a survivor's perspective and from the understanding of individual men who have been making or had to make these experiences as a result of these violations. But it also very much sort of stands in contrast to, I think, broader gender justice and gender equality aims, which cannot be realized or met, and which would mean that we sort of, I think, miss some very potent or very important transformative opportunities for change, rather than repairing these previous unequal status quos and returning men into these positions of patriarchal power. And I think, I mean, given that time is running short, I think we'll probably come back to the discussion or come back to these points in the discussions, but, you know, within the context of the article, that's sort of a central concern. And we might not necessarily have conclusive thoughts about that, but I think for us it was an important undertaking to spell out some of these, you know, contradictions and some of the pitfalls that are involved with that. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on some of that as well from a more practitioner's point of view. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you again, and then we can certainly come back to that in the Q&A, I suppose.
Amazingly done, Philip. You just hit the 10 minutes mark perfectly. Thank you very much, which leads us to Onan and Pinar, who will now share their thoughts and their take from their perspectives as researchers and practitioners about the article and the topics that are tackled in the article. So over to you, Onan and Pinar.
Thank you, Ilaria. First of all, thank you for organizing this webinar. Come over, you don't have to go away. Thank you for organizing this webinar and giving us the opportunity to be part of it. Well, Henry and Philip, I just want to say that as someone who has been, working on violence against men and boys and persons of diverse SOGIESC in conflict and displacement settings, apart from, having a history with both of you in terms of, working together, I was literally nodding the whole time when I was reading the paper, because it reflects everything that I have encountered, in the field so far. And although there's a lot to say, bearing in mind that I have 5 minutes, I especially want to reflect on your point regarding the need to move beyond merely adding LGBTQI+ in the discourse and to avoid invisibilization of women of diverse SOGIESC. Since I have been, especially focusing on this issue for the past few years, I wanted to focus on this side of the article. As Mosaic MENA, we very recently wrote a report on violence against refugee women of diverse SOGIESC in Turkey and Lebanon, which was a project funded by SVRI, and we hope that it will be published this year. Henry and I co-authored this report with other colleagues, and my PhD also focuses on these issues, as Sarah mentioned earlier. So echoing what you have written in the paper, in recent years, yes, there is growing attention in research and policy on GBV against persons of diverse SOGIESC in conflict and displacement. However, as you mentioned, there are certain shortcomings on how we approach this issue. Although there is a focus on the experiences of persons of diverse SOGIESC, it is fair to say that the attention is uneven. Several reports on CRSV in the MENA region, for example, have focused on the experiences of men of diverse SOGIESC only, and or combine these with broader sexual violence against men and boys. And there's, slight attention to the experience of trans women in these reports, including the report I authored for HRW on sexual violence against men and boys and trans women in the Syrian conflict. And on the other hand, when we take into account reports on CRSV, GBV against women in general, experiences of women of diverse SOGIESC are mostly not addressed separately from those of heterosexual and cisgender women. So this leads to an invisibilization of the vulnerabilities and needs of lesbian and bisexual women in particular, and also trans women. So even if it is not intentional, most research on GBV, including CRSV, against women do not really take into account how not conforming to dominant heterosexist and or cisgender norms and expectations greatly increases diverse SOGIESC women's risk of encountering violence on top of the broader discrimination and violence women face in patriarchal societies. As practitioners, we should bear in mind that while raising awareness on violence against men of diverse SOGIESC, we should not override the experiences of women of diverse SOGIESC. This was one of the main reasons, actually, why we focused on LGBT refugee women with Mosaic MENA in our recent report. And another shortcoming we encounter in the field is that there's an approach, approaching persons of diverse SOGIESC as a homogeneous group. So queer identities are diverse with different experiences of violence, needs, and agency. Therefore, as you also point out in your article, it is crucial for researchers, policymakers, and humanitarian actors to be aware that LGBTQI+ does not represent a homogeneous group. Gender and sexual orientation intersects with ethno-religious background, migration status, family dynamics, and the degree of visible nonconformity to heterosexual norms, gender norms, and this and there are other factors which intersect to produce different levels and degrees of risk of exposure to GBV. For example, not conforming to society's expectations of gender norms and heteronormativity the more it increases, the more the violence, let's say LGBT women face increases accordingly. So therefore, the experiences of persons of diverse SOGIESC must be taken into account separately to better understand the drivers and the effects of such violence, and to provide better services tailored for their specific needs, and not merely, use the acronym as a rights advocacy. And at this point, I would want to say that UNFPA Turkey, the humanitarian team, they have been doing a great job with their Key Refugee Groups project in order to literally leave no one behind. So I wanted to shout out to them. And on a last note, especially within the policy framework, there's little understanding of the intersections of the categories of women, men, and persons of diverse SOGIESC. So adding LGBTQI to the common wording of women, girls, and men is not enough, and it's not accurate at all, because this ignores the fact that a large proportion of persons of diverse SOGIESC also identify as women and girls and men and boys. Therefore, shortly, as you mentioned in the article, Philip, the experiences of men, women, and persons of diverse SOGIESC cannot exist, but in relation to each other. This statement, I think, on its own is a key takeaway to improve reporting, programming, and service provision to sexual violence survivors of all genders. And now I leave the floor to you, and just hush.
All right, thank you so much, Pina, and to our audience from all over the world. It really means a lot to spare your time to be with us to discuss this critical matter. I'll pick up from where Pina ended, and to pick up also from where our authors have paused now, in particular with experience from Uganda, where Philip has been researching. I bring to the conversation over a decade of practical experience. Somewhere in the paper, it is saying we are not just passive observers. I've been in the center of service provision, designing projects and seeing to it that survivors of conflict-related sexual violence do get some kind of services, from legal to psychosocial support. And from the paper, you see the group written on Men of Hope and Men of Courage, and the South Institute on Sexual Violence have been at the center of the creation of those groups as the first ever groups that was established by Refugee Law Project, as bringing together male survivors of sexual violence in one space, from a refugee angle and from those who are host as well. And we are glad to see that this conversation has taken shape up to this point. I could have taken time to talk about everything, but I'd like to talk about my own experience as a service provider in the space around how do we talk about financing and funding for work on men and boys, and what are the pushbacks that we do get. Many of the pushbacks around we are exhausting resources meant for very good purposes for women and girls, but there are conversations around the male engagement fraternity as well, or a group of men coming together. How do we work with men to embrace positive masculinity, to denounce violence against women, and to embrace support in terms of unpaid care work, and in general, doing work around women and girls. And we are glad to see that we have representatives from across the world doing similar work. So as somebody who has not been a passive observer, I've been in the heart of these kind of confrontations and tensions. And the tension that is not generally talked about is when people working with men come together, what kind of debates do they have? And which has been reflected in the conversation and in the article as well. And in particular, questions around funding, as we talk about the money is not enough, and therefore where do we channel the money? And this is what also our donors who are also represented here do struggle with. But critical conversation around is, where is the money coming from? Who is funding work on men and boys? And when they do fund those work, what are the terms and conditions that they do bring? And to what extent can the people working with men and boys negotiate and push back some of those terms and conditions? And which kind of institutions do get this kind of money when we do get this kind of support? Because some of the money end up with bigger entities or with particular institutions with a particular history on work on gender and sexuality and on sexual violence. And what are the methodology that we see? And I do say this because a lot of internal conversation in this space of actors is around who does this work and what kind of experience do they bring on the table. And that is where our donors also do follow. But above all, there are very limited conversation around to what extent do we engage the groups themselves, the survivors, from men and boys, women and girls, and including households with children born out of captivity. To what extent are we engaging them? Because we see some positive progress. that the women groups and the male groups do come together, maintaining separate spaces to talk about issues which are particular to them, but also coming together as survivors in general to go and advocate for change, to go and demand for reforms, to go and contribute to knowledge building. These are small things that I'm glad that Phil and team have been able to pick up in research, but these are things that as practitioners, we tend to engage a lot with ourselves, but not listening too much to what the groups do say, because they are finding within their own means to deal with problems that they face, letting go the differences about whether somebody is funded by international entity or a smaller entity. So those kind of small success and small progress that we can pick from the groups, from the survivors themselves, to be able to inform research, to inform practice. And I'm glad that this is a big representation online. And I look forward to engaging with people in this kind of field for a long period of time. And I'm glad that this is a space that now and forever we shall engage in this kind of issues. I thank you, and I bring you greetings from Uganda.
Thank you so much, Anna and Pinar, as well, for keeping to time. You've all been amazing so far, which is great because that means we can have lots of time for our discussion and conversation. So for this part, I will just be posing a few general questions that emerged from reading the article and thinking about the themes in the article in relation to GBV practice around the world, and the panelists will respond to those questions. So the first question I have is really following on what Onnen was saying about practice in working with survivors and what Philip highlighted earlier. In your article, you write that some male survivors of sexual violence express a desire to return to the role as main providers or head of the family, and therefore express a desire to return to hegemonic masculinity. When this is the case, how do we reconcile the survivor-centered approach, which I think most of us in this webinar are familiar with, which prioritizes survivors' wishes and needs as they express them, but how do we reconcile this approach with our broader goals of gender justice and challenging male dominance in society? And I will let the panelists decide who wants to jump in first to answer that.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and sort of try to give an answer to that, and then others can jump in, because it gives me an opportunity to sort of elaborate on the points I've rushed on earlier. But so yes, in terms of, for those who haven't read the paper, I'll give the sort of short version of that. But so for all the men that I've worked with in northern Uganda, they all reported that they have felt impacted in their masculinities in one way or another, because of the acts of sexual violence, but also because of the ripple effects of it, which impacted their ability to provide for their families because of the physical injuries and the health implications. It's also seen as impacting their ability to protect themselves and by association to protect their families. And it has also severely impacted their abilities to procreate, to be sexually active, all of which are central markers of manhood in that context, in which, you know, they now no longer can fulfill. And so most of the survivors I've worked with have expressed this, I think, from a sort of personal, individual perspective, very understandable desire to have some of these experiences and some of these harms remedied and addressed, and to be undone, and to be put back into these positions where they can provide for their families and be seen as heads of households again. And as you point out with your question, Larry, I think from a survivor-centric approach, these are very understandable concerns and wishes, considering that it's not only the men themselves who judge themselves according to these expectations, but it's also, you know, the wider societal surroundings and the expectations held by their wives and their partners, by their families, by their communities, which do sort of require them to live up to all of these expectations. Yet, as I said at the very beginning, you know, these desires in some ways represent this masculinity nostalgia, as we call it in the article, or this desire for a patriarchal golden ageism, which stands very much in contrast to these broader feminist ideals of more just and equal societies and of preventing violence against women and girls and preventing domestic violence in these contexts. And I think some of the programs, they sort of chime in these ways, and they also are attractive to some of them, and because they in some ways explicitly and mostly implicitly promise to, you know, hold the potential to get them back into these positions where they regain some of that status. In the context of Northern Uganda, and Onen can say a bit more about that, some of that work is done with survivors, is done in the context, or has been done in the context of survivors groups, which, for instance, you know, offers some sort of income generating activities, some joint sort of savings schemes, which then should be able to put back men into some of these positions where they're able to provide for their families again and fulfill these masculine expectations. For others, I think, and that's where maybe I see some sort of more hope or more potential, and we sort of briefly allude to that in the article as well, the activities in these groups whereby they would regularly meet and talk about their experiences and sort of try to collectively make sense of what has happened to them in the situations they're in now, can also harbor the potential to contribute maybe to a process of collectively challenging some of these own stereotypical ideas about masculinities and around gender equality and their views on women more broadly, whereby it sort of sets in process and facilitates a process of reimagining some of these ideals of masculinity. So some of the survivors, for instance, have, you know, by making sense of these experiences together, said that, okay, some of these more traditional norms of masculinity are also harmful to them in some ways in terms of seeking support or having not been able to seek support, and sort of, you know, reflect on the fact that there should be some change sort of occurring there in the ways of going forward. And so I think, to connect to the points that Onen and Pina have made, the key really there is, I think, to sort of facilitate these approaches more and do that relationally by bringing on board not only, you know, the men who are impacted by that, but also broader societal structures, the people that they live with, the people that they sort of, you know, who hold up expectations against them in order to do that. And I think that requires an awful lot of time and resources, and is probably yet to be seen to what extent that can be helpful, but is sort of at least an avenue, you know, where I can see some of these tensions to be sort of addressed, if not resolved, if that makes sense. I don't know if Onen or Henry or Pina want to add to any of that.
I could add a bit, unless Onen, you want to jump in first with Uganda, because I would compare that, what Philip just said, a bit with some of the work I've been doing recently in Kosovo with male survivors from the Kosovo War in 1999. And a lot of it sort of echoes what Philip just said there as well, but there's some other aspects that also came out through the interviews that are interesting. I think one of the other factors is around sort of being a breadwinner is not just being sort of through that a head of the household, but I think also for a lot of the men it was a point of self-esteem and personal feeling to not be seen as somebody who has to rely on other people's support and welfare, and that was sort of a key aspect as well. And a lot of them, because of the experience, the long-term medical, physical, psychological, emotional impact of the violence, 25 years later, still struggled to keep a job, still struggled with medical issues, and this really also affected their sense of self-esteem. Another issue in the Kosovo interviews that was very prominent, none of them had openly spoken about their experiences. And because of the fear of stigmatization, one of the biggest emotional impacts of the sexual violence that they had endured was the fear of being found out that they were a survivor and not being able to live up to the expectations of manhood, not be participating in village meetings, not being a breadwinner, not participating in their sports activities, etc., kind of cast, or they feared at least that this would cast questions about what happened to them, why aren't they participating in the same way as other men. But I think on a more positive note, and echoing, Philip, what you said there as well, around sort of using some of the work with survivors also as a possibility for questioning patriarchal norms and supporting more gender equal values. I think this is something that also came out in a lot of the interviews in Kosovo, was that many of the men did not want that any kind of help that came to them to crowd out support to women, and they were quite adamant about this is not a competition for resources, but this is something that really needs to be all survivors, all wartime or non-wartime GBV survivors need to be given the support they need. And what was also interesting was, without prompting, but a few of them also spoke up very openly against homophobic and transphobic violence in society. So because of their experience, that they already sort of transcended some of the patriarchal norms more prevalent in the rest of society.
Yeah, I think maybe to bring my own perspective from Uganda, picking up from where Philip has ended, a lot of conversation has been around how do we work with men to deal with economic crimes in a way that we're able to talk around what economic empowerment mean for them and how they're able to provide for their families and take care of their immediate families. But also my own experience is in two ways. One, the situations that it does go well, but also we have seen situations around how do you deal with unintended negative consequences. Like if some men do get some money, then they go marry other women, or including some of them who are underage. Those circumstances have also been there. So in trying to promote economic empowerment, you may end up doing some damages. So how do you put mechanisms that early on detects that, try to avert that? I see people working on prevention of sexual abuse and exploitation here with us. So those have been some of the dilemmas. But also, how do we deal with relapses, including initiatives like role model men, male mentors? These are men that we've been able to train to embrace positive masculinity, and they do well, but then at some point they fail to belong to the men in the group. They go to men's spaces and say that you're not man enough. So then what does it mean? Some of these men you've seen, they end up becoming worse version of men before they were trained, because they try to reassert themselves back to community to belong. So how do we deal with that so that we do not do damage as we try to do good? So yes, there are those kind of experiences that others are quite rewarding, but also with a bit of frustration. So as practitioners, research like this do guide us in terms of to what extent can we test certain things before we're able to do damage. So thank you, Phil, for highlighting that.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you very much, Onan, to kind of bring very concrete examples of how this risks of remasculinization actually show up in practice with while working with men, even when you're seeking to promote a gender justice approach in working with men. So I think that's a very, very valuable contribution. Another question I wanted to ask is going back to maybe what Pinar was mentioning around and also in the presentation of the article about the conflation of all homophobic and transphobic violence with sexual violence against men and boys. You have touched upon it, but it'd be great to get a bit more detail about where have you seen this conflation happen, or these different types of violence, and what do you think are the risks of this conflation?
Do you want to go first on that one?
Sure. Well, based on my experience, I mean, with all good intentions, this has also been my experience, meaning, as I mentioned earlier, there was this report when I was working for HRW LGBT rights program, and it was about, so the report is on conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys and trans women. And our initial goal was to focus on CRSV against men and boys. But then field work, as you know, researchers, you would know, it guides us and shapes the research during the way. So we came across a huge amount of data regarding how trans women were also subjected to violence because they were perceived as gay men, because they were perceived as soft men by the perpetrators. So therefore, we included this data into the report as well. And we were, we were very careful while choosing the terminology, while choosing how we drafted the report and the issue, make sure that we do not feed any conflation of homophobic and transphobic violence with, you know, sexual violence against men and boys. However, as Henrietta and Philip mentioned earlier, although unwillingly, when you put these issues together, you might be feeding such conflation. So it is important to bear in mind that to address these issues, the experiences of men and boys and the experiences of LGBTQI persons separately, and to make sure that no experience is left behind or invisibilized. And yeah, so my experience on this issue was this way. And if there's anything that Henry and Philip would like to add, please go for it.
Maybe just to add a bit there also on the need for intersectionality. There is often sort of a risk when using and you know some of the kind of invisibilizations that happen when we use this kind of men, women, boys, girls, and LGBTIQ, and then see the latter as a homogeneous group. But I think one issue as well is the need to look intersectionally at the very different kinds of risks that different people sort of under that umbrella category might be facing. And one of my standard anecdotes, in a sense, is from some research that we were doing in Colombia a few years back, which was the first time I was also looking at this issue as part of looking at gender and peace building. And we were having really excellent meetings with LGBTQI rights activists in the morning who were sort of upper middle class, university educated, Euro descendant, mostly cisgender, and their life experiences were ones with homophobia, transphobia, but also ones which were quite different from the people like in the afternoon who were Afro-descendant trans sex workers working in the same city, but living on the fringes of the city, working facing a very, very different set of precariousness and vulnerabilities from upper middle class LGBTQI persons. So we do need to look at issues of class, of race, of location, etc., in the context of LGBTQI as well, in addition to looking at gender and sexual orientation.
Thanks. Unless someone has something burning to say, I might move on to the next question, because there are many questions coming in from the audience. So I want to make sure we leave time for that. So we've been talking mostly about work with male survivors of gender-based violence, but your article also mentions GBV prevention activities that engage men. And so I was wondering if you have examples or thoughts about how the risks of remasculinization or the enforcement of heteronormative and patriarchal norms might also emerge in GBV prevention activities that engage men.
I feel like I'm taking a bit too much space here, but I'll maybe just kick off here. I think one end there had some really interesting insights, and maybe I know you can say a bit more about that. But I think there is a risk in terms of centering men in GBV work that men then take up the space that should be there for women as well. And something that in my previous work we've been trying to do then is, if working with couples or with family units, to have separate spaces for men and women to engage with them separately, so that men don't take up all that space, and that women feel safe to speak about their issues. I think sort of what one mentioned there about relapse and the resistance that men who do want to make a change might face from their peer groups, but also from their family members and community members. That is something that needs to be taken into account as well. But also there is a risk, I think, of maybe giving, I mean, it is always important to give participants in these kinds of programs positive feedback, but there's also a risk that we over-celebrate small changes, incremental changes by men when they do a part of the work that women already are expected to do anyways. So we might be sort of giving a bit too much applause for very incremental changes, and thereby sort of centering men's agency and crowding out women's voices as well.
If we have time, maybe just to briefly add to that, and sorry, Henry, I didn't want to sort of throw you under the bus there to speak first, but I also wanted to be mindful of not centering my own male voice in these discussions too much, to instead center your male voice in these discussions. But just, I mean, I think one risk that there really is in some of these programmings, and I don't have an awful lot of expertise on that, but I think it's the types of masculinities that are sort of featured there and that are sort of presented there, which are often very Western-centric, very neo-colonial, based on very, you know, Western ideas of what it means, and very heteronormative ideas of what it means to be a good man as well, which I think have some, you know, very, latent homophobic, heteronormative underpinnings and undertones. And I think the risk and the implications of that is, you know, what types of sort of new masculinities are being formed then in order to prevent or to, you know, get us towards more gender just visions, which, you know, are not as just as they're made out to be in the first place, if that makes sense. And so I think, you know, and then, you know, the ways in which that's reflected in programming and practice, sort of implemented sort of from the global north, sort of in these contexts, sort of, you know, in a toolkit-based approach, as if that would just translate everywhere and anyhow, regardless of local constructions of gender orders. Yeah, that's where I see sort of the permanent, you know, sort of constant risk in some of these approaches.
Thank you both. And then, was there anything you wanted to add here around GBV prevention work with men? Not to put you on the spot, just to give you the chance before I ask my last question.
Yeah, I think from my own experience, we've always been guided by a key question that, okay, when you mobilize men and bring them in one space, what do you tell them? The first sentence matters a lot in terms of whether you keep having a conversation or you lose a few. So that's where we've been having a divide in terms of, do you enter from men's own perspective of violence to talk about ending violence in general, not necessarily only ending violence against particular genders, and having to talk about men raising much better men and children in general, not just raising much better boys, but also much better daughters as well. So yes, in terms of what they call the spiraling effect, working with the groups, smaller groups of men who come together to embrace the different pillars of men engagement, men and sexual reproductive health rights, men and HIV/AIDS prevention, men and embracing inclusivity, then those men reach out to other men as agents of change to be able to transform themselves, not only to work with women and girls, but also to try to end violence in general. So from different trainings, bringing a group of men from a different environment to share experience and talk about what it means and how violence affects them. So when men begin to understand that living in a particular way affects them as well, then they begin to understand what it means and the difficulties that it takes to be a man, but also to work with women in general. And I think there's a question from Anderson, if I could also, in terms of, is there any work with family members and partners? With the invention from our work from Professor Chris Dolan, who's not here with us, former director of Refugee Law Project, he started an initiative called multi-survivor programming, where we're talking about from one person to many and talking around co-perpetration, because in the event of the experiences, there are people who've been violated together in a home. So only treating the husband or the wife and leaving the children doesn't help. So the multi-survivor programming is when we learn from the children. They say, when I grow up, I want to be a soldier. You ask, but why does this child want to grow up and be a soldier? Because they witness experiences of violence. Now, some of them say, when I grow up, I want to be a lawyer. So there's that kind of party, and Phil, you're here, you must have been able to witness this, that from the LRA perspective, many of these children born of captivity, when they get to school, many of them want to be lawyers. So how do we work with these children so that they support their parents and the other way around to also deal with vicarious trauma so that we're able to talk generally about what violence means for them as a household, but for community at large? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my last question, which hopefully also speaks to one of the questions that has just popped up in the chat, is let's assume someone reads your paper or has come to this webinar and is fully on board with the argument. They understand that it can be risky to commit to sort of do this kind of work with men and boys as survivors or as potential perpetrators. But they do have some funding or a project that is meant to implement a program with male survivors or a GBV prevention program with men. So in this case, what resources or examples would you recommend that they look at to design and implement a different kind of program that doesn't fall in the patriarchal pitfalls that you have articulated in the article? As concrete as you can be, please.
I'm happy to go first, Henry, and then you can join in and I'll make it quick. I mean, that's a brilliant question, Ilaria, and I love the sort of, positivity of that, the potential of that, and the dreaming that it allows us to do, right? I mean, who doesn't want someone to email me afterwards and say, I'm your prince and I have a lot of money that you can access through this bank account. I get these emails all the time, and now this is happening and I can sort of make that connect to my work. But I think, we've sort of circled around that a little bit in the discussion here already, right? I think the key really is that these are relational programs that not just sort of focus on work with men and boys or work with LGBTQI survivors or work with women and girls, and not just focus on men as victims or men as perpetrators, but that bring all of that together and that do that relationally for changes to occur at the individual level, at the structural level, at the societal level, at the community level, and so on and so forth. And obviously, this type of work would require an awful lot of resources and time. This is not something that is done in a 3-year project window. But that requires longitudinal changes and processes. And some of the examples, for instance, that Onen has mentioned now with the group work being done where the families and the partners or the communities of individual survivors, whether they are male or female survivors in that context, are being brought into these discussions and brought into the process, I think holds a lot of potential. But yeah, Henry, maybe you want to add from a more sort of overarching structural perspective, what would you do with all the money that people are going to give us after this?
Yeah, that's a great idea to think about. I think sort of what would be ideally the case would be that we would be able to channel that money into programs that are very much locally led and locally designed, and are survivor-centric. So I think some of the points, Philip, that you raised are really important. The relationality, be it in work with survivors or be it in work with GBV prevention, has been shown to be key. So not working with men separately, but also working with people around them, taking what are called socio-ecological approaches, which try and look at the different factors that lead to vulnerabilities, that lead to violence, be it economic vulnerability, be it gender norms, be it pressure, societal pressures. And these will, what I think is really key is that these will have to look very different in different contexts, that there is not one model that is going to work everywhere. And it really depends also on what you aim to do with that work with men. Are you looking at working with male survivors? Then that's going to be quite different from trying to do work on preventing domestic violence. There might be some overlap, but there might be differences. If you're working with people in the community in general and trying to prevent domestic and intimate partner violence in general, then that needs to be a very different approach from one that is working with convicted perpetrators, for example, which needs a very different kind of approach. So really thinking through what is it that you want to do? Why do you want to work with the men? Who are your allies? What are the potential resistances that you might face? And how you can build those in? And especially, what are the resources that you have? Because a lot of these programs do need a lot more time than we are allocated in humanitarian contexts, for example. And here again, so working through local organizations is really key because the local organizations will be there even after the internationals leave. But over to Onan and Pina if you want to jump in there.
Okay, I see a shaking of heads in that room. So thank you so much for sharing all your insights. And now we get to the exciting part of answering questions from the audience, which have been coming in thick. So first of all, apologies to all audience members if we can't get all of the questions in, but we'll try to do our best. I wanted to start with a comment and then a question, and feel free to address the comment if you want to, but since it was posed as a comment, but I think it's an important one, so I did want to mention it. And sorry if I don't get all the names of the people who ask questions, but someone said, you mentioned the invisibility of lesbian, bisexuals, and trans women, but you haven't mentioned trans men, and they felt that they are missing as well, and so wanted to just bring attention to that. So that was the comment. And a question that I think many of us are interested in is, has the panel observed organizations or movements promoting hegemonic masculinities who sees funding for conflict-related sexual violence for male survivors or advocacy space to advance patriarchal policies? So it's a question around like any concrete examples that you have of organizations that have seized that kind of funding in conflict-related sexual violence and male survivor work to then use that funding to advance patriarchal policy, or if not funding, advocacy space. So I'm going to pose that question, let you answer that, and then we'll go to the next question.
So to take over the mic again, but maybe I'll start quickly with the question around invisibility of lesbian, bisexual women and trans men. And this is something that's Pina probably can also say a bit more about from our field work in Turkey and Lebanon. And that was an issue we really faced in our research there, and I'm currently facing some of the research I'm doing here in Thailand and Myanmar as well, is that even though we are working through support organizations for LGBTIQ persons, they also do not reach all of the members of the community, so to say. And in part, this might be also due to kind of how some of these organizations have grown historically, where it has been men, gay men, bisexual men, and trans women who have been sort of more at the forefront of the movements. And those spaces are then maybe not seen as welcoming by LGBT women or trans men. But in the case of Turkey as well, there's also some of the particular ways in which Syrian lesbian and bisexual women had crossed the border into Turkey, which made them much more difficult to reach out to. But I'll let Pina say more about that.
Yes, thanks, Henry. So thank you for that comment, first of all, because yes, of course, there's also, attention missing for the experience of trans men as well. So I agree on that for sure. In terms of our experience, as Henry mentioned, while we were conducting research in Turkey and Lebanon, and having worked with service providers in both countries, I would like to say that that we came across specifically a hardship where service providers were facing a hardship to reach out to lesbian and bisexual women. And again, I would want to take this as a group because, as I said, there are different components in terms of background, migration status. So, for example, in the case of Iranian women, it was easier to reach out to them because the reason they came to Turkey and Lebanon were due to political violence, for example, so different reasons. So they were more out and about, I would say, in both countries, and they were more open to reach out to services. But in the case of Syrian women, due to the reasons of coming to fleeing the country due to conflict, for example, most of them came with their families, so they lived with their families, or they were forcibly married to others, and therefore they were not really connected to the LGBTQI community. They did not have information or access to information to existing services. So therefore, we saw that there was a huge problem reaching out to Syrian lesbian women in both countries. And that was also something that we faced, therefore, in terms of data collection. So in terms of, so here I think that the key point is to be aware that, be aware of the intersectionalities of different identity makers and how that affects lesbian women, bisexual women, trans men, and gay men in terms of reaching out to services, having information of services, and having access to services, I would say. So yeah, thank you so much.
Did anyone want to take the question around organizations or actors capturing funding or advocacy space to promote patriarchal agendas, let's say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm still sitting with that question and thinking about it because I don't have any concrete examples, and I'd be as curious as you having asked the question about that. I mean, I think in terms of, you know, broad actors or categories of actors, I think there's really a risk. And maybe there are some tendencies that I'm not aware of some of that, you know, advocacy around that in the language being co-opted by men's rights activism, you know, in general, and sort of some of the, you know, the approach of asking questions of what about the men that come from a very, you know, well-reasoned and understandable concern about the realities and the perspectives of male survivors, which is a question that I have asked, is, you know, asked similarly, but with very different intentions from men's rights activist movements, you know, which sort of have, I think, a different agenda and come from a very different angle. And so I see that there would be some potential for that to be the case. But I don't know, Henry, do you have any more concrete examples of organizations doing precisely that or actors doing precisely that?
I've seen it more in sort of policy and advocacy spaces, less so in, I don't have any concrete examples of funding being taken over, but I'm sure there is funding that is then going through other channels, through more social conservative channels, to some of these groups. But yeah, definitely so in the advocacy space, there is a lot of pushback against any kind of work on gender equality, and the argument of what about the men is often used to take over that space and sorry, and to push for some more heteronormative patriarchal values in that space.
But if any of the participants in the audience have any examples, I'd love to hear them. I mean, you know, this is your chance to share your expertise with us as well, which we'd love to learn from.
I might do a very uncool thing as a chair and share my own research on this topic in the chat. I'll just send a link. It's not specifically on advocacy around male survivors, but it's around how concepts of gender inclusivity or intersectionality have been used in anti-feminist ways in the humanitarian space. So I'll do that at the end if anyone wants to. And there is some sort of direct quotes there that you can trace back and figure out more concrete examples. I'm going to combine a few, there were a few questions around working with women, with family members, with mothers. So I'm going to try and combine a few of these so that you can address them all together. So very interested in hearing experiences of women's attitudes towards positive masculinity and their roles in perpetuating patriarchal stereotypes, including homophobia. And then a similar question is the types of support that mothers and family members who might themselves be survivors, that the kind of support they can provide to boys who are exposed to sexual violence, and other vulnerable individuals. And again, working with family members or close relations of men and boy survivors. And if you have any examples of approaches of that. I think Onen partly answered that already, but please, if you have anything to add to this, and in general, the role of women in these kind of programming and sort of advocacy efforts would be helpful.
I'm happy to start with that a little bit, and again, just offer some preliminary thoughts for the others to finalize. In particular, the second point you've raised about, the support of family members, of mothers, of, others within survivors' lives, because I think it sort of always comes back to this point that we have been making repeatedly about, relational approaches to that. And you mentioned at some point, I think, the survivor-centric approach, and I think on the one hand, really excited to sort of see that, to put survivors' needs and priorities sort of set at the center and heart of these debates. But I also sometimes think it misses an important point of both the harms that are a result of these violations, but also the avenues of support are not as individualized as they're often made out in these survivor-centric approaches, right? I think the result is often on the individual survivor and what they have experienced and what they need, and it neglects the fact that there's ripple effects of, these violations of gendered harms sort of across, family structures, communal structures, it travels sort of from the individual towards their partners as well. It has an implication on that, and that applies, I think, to survivors of all genders. That's not specifically focused on male survivors, but given that that is some of the work that I've done, that's what I would maybe draw on. It also ignores maybe some of the intergenerational aspects. And I think the same applies to the support sort of structures or mechanisms or coping mechanisms that are put in place. And I think as much as the family, for instance, or family structures can be, the source of much harm and injustice and exclusion and stigmatization, and again, that applies for survivors of all genders, they can also be important avenues of support. I think they need to be sort of brought into the conversation if we want to change about not doing these remasculizing messengers and sort of trying to change some of that. And so I think there's an awful lot of potential to be tapped into that by bringing that on board and doing that work relationally. And again, I think, as you said, Ilaria, as well, Onen's examples of, doing programming where it's not just the men who have been experiencing these violations, but also their families or their wives being brought in, their children being brought in, and reflecting on what that meant, for them as groups, but also as individuals, gets us into that direction. I'm going to leave it at that if the others want to join in there.
Maybe add a bit on to the family members. And I think it's very hard to give generalizations there. There's so many different ways in which family members might react to disclosure of one of the kin being survivor of sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. We've seen just in a very small sample in Kosovo, for example, that I mentioned earlier, there's a whole spectrum of responses from partners, for example, wives sometimes being hugely supportive, sometimes demanding a divorce, parents being supportive, parents being hugely unsupportive, children being sometimes, again, very supportive or being a source of indirect support for the survivors. At other times, the children then reject their parents, and everything in between there. So I think it's hard to generalize there. And maybe I'll pass the ball in a second to Pina to talk about some of the diverse experiences that in our research with especially trans survivors of violence in Turkey and Lebanon, we saw in terms of family members' roles as supporters or as perpetrators of violence. But I just want to quickly say about women's support for patriarchal values, or men's support for patriarchal values. I think, again, this is something that kind of need to look at in a relational way, that men and women can hold these patriarchal values and be mutually supporting or demanding that other men uphold certain ways of being a man, or they can question them. So I think it is important to not assume that women will be pro-gender equality or anti-patriarchal, but some of the work that we've been doing as well has required working with mothers to make sure that they don't expect their sons to become domineering fathers or partners in the relationship. So I think that there's a real need to look at these gender norms, gender work in a relational way. But I don't know, Pina, if you want to say something about the family's role in violence in some of our research.
Yes, very briefly, maybe. Based on the findings that we collected in Turkey and Lebanon, we came across that generally, when we look at the male family members, they were the ones who were subjecting, their LBT children to physical violence, to sexual violence. However, when it came to female family members, they were the ones who would provide support and, try to protect them sometimes from their male family members. For example, there were cases where, let's say, a trans Syrian woman would flee to Turkey, and then his brothers would be chasing him still in Turkey to subject her to all sorts of physical violence you can think of. And then there were cases where, for example, mothers, aunts, or sisters would text their children, their trans children, for example, to let them know that their brothers were in the country, they were looking out for them, and to hide and to protect themselves, for example. So in the research, we came across to a difference of reactions from female family members and the roles of male family members when it came to physical violence, psychological violence, and sexual violence within this context.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to cover all questions, but they're all very good questions, and I'm struggling to pick the last one. But there was a question or a set of questions early on raising the issue that the person was asking is feeling that the impact of sexual violence of men, and particularly in conflict, remains underexplored, and asking for recommendations for advocacy, but also academic discourse to raise the profile of this issue, I guess. So if you have any quick thoughts, maybe we can squeeze in a final one after. Let's see.
Yeah, maybe just to come in. I think some participants have done a good job already on that one. I see a lot of links already shared, but also maybe there is also, I think one of the earlier documents, I think published by UNHCR, working with men and boy survivors of gender-based violence and forced displacement. I think that could also, we provided some of the links here. It could also be of help. So yeah, I think they're endless, but maybe it's maybe for the organizers as well, we can be able to put some recommendation together, which could be shared alongside the recordings of the webinar. But thank you, and thank you for the observation.
Okay, if there's nothing to add here, I will ask a final question because I really like this question by someone working for HIAS in Ukraine, where they provide case management to GBV survivors near the front line. So they were reflecting on your necessary perspectives regarding patriarchy and how little progress has been made in the past years or decades, really. What do you think are the main challenges that women and girls face to eliminate masculinity, maybe hegemonic masculinity or dominant masculinity, and by extension, violence against women and girls? And this, I think, is the really good part. What mechanisms do you think patriarchy uses in humanitarian context to reproduce itself? So final thoughts, 5 minutes. Any final words you want to share as well on the topic? This is your opportunity. And then we'll hand over to Sarah to wrap us up.
I'll maybe start off just to kind of give myself one of the easier to find answers. I think, I mean, the different challenges faced by women and girls in terms of patriarchy are different in different settings. In some places, it's very overt, and there's also overt pushback on women's rights, on sexual and reproductive health rights, etc. But I think one of the more difficult areas to work in is where there is an assumption that we already are gender equal, and that we are already unpatriarchal, and that we are post-racial, etc., and not seeing the hidden patriarchal, hidden patriarchy, hidden heterosexism, hidden racism in the systems that we work in. And I think that is a challenge in an area of work like the humanitarian sector, where there is an assumption that we have transcended these kinds of hierarchies and these kinds of discriminatory norms. And addressing them then also becomes a lot more painful internally, because people don't want to be challenged on what they think are their core ideals. So I think that would be sort of one of the areas, is making more visible how our own systems can also be discriminatory, even when they strive not to be.
Yeah, I'll briefly add to that as well. And want to echo, it's a brilliant question. It gives us all so much to think about, I think, and I'm not sure I can sort of answer the second bit of it, which is maybe the more crucial bit of it. But I also think, in addition to what Henry has said, you know, besides sort of the very, you know, the extent to which all of these norms and cultures are so much embedded and ingrained in daily lives, and are particularly so in the context where we work in institutions in the global north, and, you know, very liberal, so quote unquote Europe, you know, are so normalized that we don't even see them ourselves anymore, or are made not to see them anymore, and are made to believe that we're sort of beyond them, yet we're not at all. I think what sort of further complicates that is also the ways in which these patriarchal norms are then very much wedded to and embedded within and entangled with, you know, ideas of capitalism, of coloniality, and so on and so forth, you know, and how these all reinforce and support one another, how all of that is tied in with, you know, growing militarism, as we can see everywhere around the globe right now, which makes it all the more difficult, but also all the more urgent to tackle and to deal with and to engage with. And I think, you know, that must ultimately be, I think, the aim of all of these bits and pieces of work that each and every one of us is doing here, to try and tackle that in one way or another, and give the patriarchy small bits and hits to ultimately be able to smash it. But yeah, I would be able to give, I wish I would be able to give a more hopeful answer on how we can do that. But I'm sort of on the questioning side with whoever it is who asked that brilliant question. Yeah.
Any final thoughts on Pinar?
I think for me, it's mostly a thank you. I see some provocative insights coming in at the time. Perhaps I wish, and maybe another related webinar follows. I see quite interesting things coming in. We don't have time to respond to all of them. So maybe to the AOR, please, let's maybe push on the conversation and maybe invite a few other people and keep the conversation rolling. It's also good to see what others are doing. Unfortunately, we may not provide inclusive answers to all the questions. Others are also learning. For me, it will be good to share in the coming months to come back. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for the invite.
Yes, and very briefly, I also wanted to say a thank you to the audience for helping us conduct such a fruitful discussion with all of your questions. And thank you, Sarah, Ilaria, and the whole team for giving us space to talk about all of these issues and keep the discussion going. And this is how we will be getting somewhere all together as a team all together. So thank you so much for having us and giving us the chance to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I might just add one thing from my side, as someone that has kind of been moving between the practitioner and the academic side, I think one way that patriarchy keeps itself alive in the humanitarian system and beyond is by making it look like a lot is being done to address violence against women or address gender equality, but actually in the end, not really putting any resources or any efforts behind that. So in academic spaces, I hear all the time that gender-based violence is one of the most funded areas of humanitarian response, which, as Sarah is demonstrating, is so far from the truth, and the data shows that. But by creating this image that lots of resources are going towards gender-based violence or women's issues or women's rights, they also create a sense that actually men are being left behind, and more too many resources are going towards women. And we know if we're working in gender-based violence that this couldn't really be further from the truth. So I think going back to what Anne was saying at the beginning, thinking about funding and how is funding being allocated within these spaces, it is one of really the key ways in which we can think about breaking this patriarchal deadlock, even when we talk about gender-based violence. So I'll thank you all very much for sticking with us till the end, and hand over to Sarah for the conclusion.
Thanks, everybody. It was a great panel discussion, as I knew it would be. A lot of thought-provoking questions. Please take the evaluation poll at the end. And if you have any questions for us, gbvcop@gmail.com. We will capture all of the resources that were shared in the chat, and we will send them out to all of you who are registered for the webinar, and maybe a few more as well, depending on what the panelists might want to share too. For those of you who are on the community of practice, Philip, Henry, and Ilaria are all members as well, so you can continue the discussion on the community of practice. Maybe Onen and Pinar would like to join us too. We'll invite them. But thank you so much for a really very interesting and enriching discussion. And I am so grateful to know you all and thankful that you came together. So thanks very much, and we'll see you online.